My name is Maria, and I'm about to turn 50. When I stop to think about everything I've lived through, the first things that come to mind aren't moments of happiness or successes, but the decisions I made and the ones I never could make. I see clearly the regrets that have shaped my existence and the desires that, although buried deep in my heart, have never stopped burning fiercely. Over the years, those desires have been my only faithful companion, burning me from the inside, pushing me toward places I never imagined I could reach, or worse, toward places I didn't even want to go. When I was 20, my life already seemed completely mapped out. I was born and raised on a small ranch in the state of Jalisco, surrounded by agave fields and distant mountains. My parents, lifelong farmers, always taught me that the destiny of women like me wasn't something you could choose. They believed firmly in tradition, in the custom of arranging marriages to ensure family stability. That's how I ended up married to Pedro, a man 10 years older than me. Pedro wasn't a bad man. He was hardworking, dedicated to the land, and over time he came to manage the ranch that had belonged to his parents before him. However, our marriage wasn't born from love, but from an agreement between our families. In those days, it was common for parents to arrange marriages without consulting the children. I remember the day my father told me I would marry Pedro. His tone allowed no argument. "He's a good man," he would tell me, as if that were all that mattered. And I, young and inexperienced, had no choice but to accept. We got married in a small adobe church on a hot day in July. The ceremony was modest, without much fuss, but our parents' faces reflected pride. Pedro was happy with the life we had begun together, but from the first moment, I knew this wasn't what I wanted. While he dedicated himself fervently to the ranch, I felt trapped. It was as if, instead of marrying Pedro, I had married the land itself, with its endless fields and suffocating silence. Pedro was a simple man, without grand ambitions. He would rise with the first ray of sun and wouldn't return until nightfall, exhausted after a full day's work. He tended the cattle, planted, harvested, and repeated that routine day after day without complaining. He seemed content with that life. I, on the other hand, felt that each day spent on that ranch was a lost day. My dreams were bigger than the life I was leading. Although I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, the only thing I knew with certainty was that I couldn't continue like this. Over time, the distance between Pedro and me grew larger. It wasn't just that there was no love between us, but that our lives ran in opposite directions. While he sank deeper into the routine of the countryside, I consumed myself in resentment, in the desire to escape from this life I hadn't chosen. Then came the day I discovered that Pedro was cheating on me. It wasn't a surprise, if I'm honest. Rumors were already circulating in town. The neighbor women whispered among themselves that they had seen Pedro with other women, and although they never told me directly, their glances made it clear. One day Pedro came home late, drunk, staggering, with his shirt wrinkled and stained with red lipstick. Seeing him, I didn't feel the pain I might have expected. I felt no jealousy, no rage. The only thing I felt was relief. I no longer loved him. Perhaps I never had. But at that moment, I knew with certainty that the little affection I had once felt for him had disappeared completely. In fact, I felt repulsion. It was unbearable to share a bed with him, and every time he touched me, my skin shuddered with disgust. So when I saw him come in that night, the only thing I felt was a silent liberation. Not having to fulfill my duties as a wife gave me a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in a long time. I couldn't go on like this. I was trapped in a loveless marriage, in a life I didn't want. However, there was no way out. In those times, a woman who abandoned her husband had no place in society. My family wouldn't take me back, and the town would brand me as shameless. I was cornered. One morning while I was making coffee as usual, I overheard Pedro talking to a friend outside the house. It was early, the sun was just beginning to light up the horizon, and the air was fresh. I didn't pay attention at first, but something in their conversation caught my interest. The friend mentioned a man from a nearby village, someone who had completely changed his life after making a pact with a witch. Hearing those words, my heart skipped a beat. At first I thought it was just one of those stories they tell in towns, another piece of gossip. But the conversation turned more serious. According to the friend, the man had acquired land, cattle, and had prospered rapidly. No one knew how he had done it, but everyone in town murmured that his fortune came from a dark agreement, a pact with forces they didn't understand. My hands trembled slightly as I continued preparing the coffee, trying not to make noise so I could keep listening. Pedro, as always, didn't give importance to the story. He laughed and changed the subject, saying he preferred a humble, quiet life without risking his soul for worldly riches. Who in their right mind would do something like that for money? He joked with that light tone he always used to dismiss what he didn't understand. I prefer to live simply, happy with my woman, he added with a smile, as if our life were an example of bliss. My heart raged hearing that. How could Pedro speak of happiness when our life was far from it? Living in poverty, working every day, without a future, without ambitions, it wasn't what I wanted. While he settled for that monotonous life, I drowned in frustration. He never understood my desires, never wanted more than what was right in front of him, while I dreamed of something bigger, of a life outside that miserable routine. The story of the pact continued echoing in my mind for days. Every time I looked at Pedro, I felt more and more the weight of my loveless life, of being tied to a destiny I hadn't chosen. My desire to escape grew. But I knew I had to be cautious. I couldn't just run away. There was no safe place to go. And the pact, was that really an option? The mere idea frightened me, but it also attracted me in a way I couldn't ignore. Weeks after hearing the story, my desire to change my life became unbearable. I knew something had to be done, but I still didn't know how. One day while Pedro was working in the fields, I made a bold decision. I decided to go visit Juana, a neighbor I used to talk with from time to time. Juana was a reserved woman, but there was always something in her gaze that suggested she knew more than she let on. I thought maybe she could help me understand more about that man and his pact. The walk to Juana's house was long, but my determination pushed me forward. My heart beat strongly as I tried to organize my thoughts. How would I broach the subject without raising suspicion? I knew country people were distrustful, and if I said too much, they might start talking about me. But my desire to change my life was stronger than anything. When I arrived at Juana's house, the sun was already beginning to descend, tinting the sky a deep orange that you only see in country landscapes. My nervousness grew as I approached, but I couldn't back out. Juana received me with a surprised smile. She clearly wasn't expecting visitors. After a brief chat about trivialities, I gathered the courage to mention what I had come to ask. I heard Pedro talking with his friend about a man who made a pact to become rich, I said in the calmest voice I could manage, although my hands were already sweating. Juana looked at me intently for a moment, as if evaluating my intentions. I knew she wasn't like the other women in town, always ready to criticize and condemn anyone who didn't follow the rules. Finally, she set aside what she was doing and leaned on the doorframe, looking me directly in the eyes. "And what do you think about that, Maria?" she asked in a casual tone, but there was something deeper in her gaze. "I don't know what to think," I replied, trying to sound unconcerned. "But if it's true that that man changed his life, it doesn't surprise me that someone would do whatever is necessary to improve. Life here isn't easy." Juana let out a soft laugh, though it wasn't mocking, it seemed more like a kind of recognition. After a moment of silence, she confessed what I never would have imagined. "That man you heard about was my grandfather who helped him. My grandfather is a healer, and he knows how to connect with forces you can't even imagine." My thoughts raced. I never would have imagined that Juana, the quiet woman who barely spoke with others, was connected to something so deep and mysterious. I knew I had to act cautiously, but also that I was closer to a way out of my situation. "And do you think he could help someone else?" I asked, trying not to let my voice betray how desperate I was. She studied me for a long moment before responding. "It's not something to take lightly, Maria. Pacts always have a price, and those who make them never end up entirely well. But if you really want to know more, I could take you to him. My heart beat strongly. I knew this was the opportunity one had been waiting for, but I also understood that any misstep could condemn me forever. Still, the desire to escape that miserable life weighed more than fear. We agreed that Juana would take me to see her grandfather in a few days, when Pedro was busy in the fields. The plan had to be meticulous, and neither of us could raise suspicion. In the following days, my mind was consumed by the excitement and fear of what was to come. When the agreed day arrived, the nervousness that invaded me was almost unbearable. During those previous days, Juana and I exchanged complicit glances but barely spoke in public. We couldn't risk someone suspecting. Juana passed by my house just before sunset. We made sure no one was watching and set out on the path toward the ranch where her grandfather, the healer, lived. As we walked in silence along the dirt paths, my mind kept wandering, trying to imagine what the man who had the power to change lives would be like, granting wealth in exchange for something so uncertain. The air felt heavy, as if the atmosphere itself were charged with something more than the simple passage of time. Juana's grandfather's house was far from the rest of the town, surrounded by old, tall trees that cast an imposing shadow. Twilight wrapped the landscape in orange and reddish tones, and the tree branches moved gently with the breeze, emitting whispers that seemed to contain ancient secrets. When we arrived, my heart was beating so hard I feared Juana would notice. Juana's grandfather, the healer, was waiting for us on the threshold of his house. He was an elderly man with a long, graying beard and small but penetrating eyes that seemed able to see beyond the visible. When our gazes crossed, I felt a chill run through my body. Without saying a word, he invited me in, and Juana stayed in the patio watching from a distance, respecting the ritual that was about to begin. The interior of the house was dark, illuminated only by a few candles arranged in a circle on the floor. The atmosphere smelled of herbs and something else, something I couldn't immediately identify, but that filled the air with a dense, mysterious sensation. The healer moved calmly, without haste, as if he had performed this type of ceremony countless times before. He didn't say much to me, but his words were direct and loaded with meaning. "So you're the one who wants to change her life," he said in a raspy but clear voice. I nodded in silence, feeling that any word I spoke might break the sacred atmosphere of the place. My hands trembled slightly, and I tried to remain calm. "For the work to be done, there is a price," the healer continued as he lit more candles around the circle. His voice was calm, but the certainty in his words was undeniable. 2 cows, 7 chickens, and a pig. That's what I need." My mind raced. I knew I couldn't simply take those animals from the ranch without Pedro noticing. He would never allow me to give away something so valuable for what, in his eyes, would be madness. I would have to be very clever to get the animals out without him discovering it. As the healer looked at me, I understood there was no turning back. If I really wanted to escape that miserable life, I would have to risk everything. "Come back when you have what I need," he said, blowing out the candles in one breath. I said goodbye to him and left the house without saying anything. Juana was waiting for me outside, her face calm but with an air of complicity. We walked back in silence, both knowing what was to come. My mind was busy finding a way to fulfill what had been asked of me. Time was pressing, and I knew I couldn't wait too long. By the time I got home, I already had a plan. I knew Pedro had a habit of drinking sugarcane liquor on weekends, especially when he felt exhausted from fieldwork. I decided to take advantage of that. I would make him drink more than usual, enough so that he would fall into a deep sleep. That way I could take the animals without him noticing. That night I began to prepare my strategy. The weekend arrived quickly, and with it, my opportunity. I cooked his favorite food, a beef casserole with handmade tortillas, and left a bottle of liquor visible. During dinner, I praised him for his hard work on the ranch, assuring him he deserved a good rest. Pedro, flattered and tired, began to drink. I made sure the bottle never emptied, serving him more and more until he finally fell asleep on the sofa, snoring deeply. My heart beat strongly as I headed to the corral. I had to be quick and silent. I took the 2 cows, the 7 chickens, and the pig, and carefully led them along the dark paths toward the healer's house. Each step I took made me feel as if I were committing a crime, but the adrenaline was stronger than the fear. I couldn't let Pedro discover what I was doing. Everything had to seem like a simple robbery when he woke up. The healer was already waiting for me when I arrived. He was standing outside his house with Juana by his side, both in silence. When he saw the animals, he nodded in approval. "You've done good work," he said with a somber smile. "Now we can begin the ritual." It would take place that same night. I handed over the animals to the healer and prepared myself for what was to come. I knew that when I returned to the ranch, Pedro would wake up late with a strong hangover and wouldn't suspect me. He would simply assume that someone had taken the animals while he slept, and I would make sure he blamed the alcohol for his carelessness. I entered the healer's house, where the candles were already arranged in the circle I had seen before. This time the atmosphere was even denser, almost as if the air had become thicker. I could feel a strange energy around me, something I had never experienced before. The healer began to intone words in a language I didn't recognize, and the tension in the room became palpable. Suddenly everything stopped. The healer looked at me with that same enigmatic smile. "It's done," he said. "Your life will begin to change soon." I left the house that night with a mixture of fear and excitement. The pact was sealed, and now all that remained was to wait for the consequences. I knew there was no turning back. I returned to the ranch that night with a mixture of emotions difficult to describe. On one hand, fear ran through my body. I had done something beyond what any rational person would do. I had crossed an invisible line and didn't know for certain what would come next. But at the same time, I felt an emotion I hadn't felt in years: hope. The healer's promise echoed in my mind like an echo: "Your life will begin to change soon." Those words repeated in my head with every step I took on the way home. When I arrived, Pedro was still deeply asleep on the sofa. The heavy snoring he emitted filled the small living room, and the strong smell of liquor permeated the air. I looked at him for a moment, and a feeling of relief invaded me. My plan had worked. Pedro would suspect nothing, and in the morning when he discovered the animals were gone, he would assume it was a simple theft. The pact was sealed, and now all that remained was to wait. The next morning, Pedro woke up late with an obvious hangover. He complained of a strong headache and cursed the drink as he prepared to go to the corrals. I followed him, feigning a concern I didn't feel. I knew exactly what we would find. When we reached the corral and Pedro saw that the cows, chickens, and pig had disappeared, his reaction was exactly as I had imagined. He began to curse, blaming the thieves and, above all, himself for having drunk so much. "How could I be so stupid?" he shouted, hitting the wooden fence. How did I not hear anything? I simply nodded with an expression of false anguish on my face, while inside I felt triumphant. My plan had been perfect. Pedro would never suspect me, and now the first step toward my new life had been taken. The days passed without major apparent changes, but I was attentive to every small detail, waiting for the sign that the pact had begun to take effect. That's when the unexpected happened. One afternoon, Pedro went out horseback riding as he usually did to check the ranch fences. Hours later, some acquaintances came running to the house with terrible news. Pedro had fallen from his horse and hit his head on a rock. He was unconscious, and they had taken him immediately to the town hospital. When I heard the news, a part of me wanted to feel something, anything: worry, sadness, fear. But I felt nothing. I didn't care what happened to Pedro, because deep down I knew his accident wasn't a simple coincidence. The pact was working. The gears of destiny had begun to turn. I waited until the next morning to go to the hospital. I didn't want to appear too unconcerned, but neither did I want to rush there like a desperate wife, because I wasn't one. Upon arriving, I was received by the doctor who had attended Pedro, a handsome, friendly young man with deep green eyes that I couldn't help but notice. He was educated, kind, and explained the situation to me in a serious tone. "Your husband is in a coma," he said with a serious expression. The blow was very strong, and we can't know when, or if, he will wake up. While he spoke, I feigned the concern a devoted wife should feel, but inside there was no trace of that emotion. I felt nothing. The only thing that caught my attention was the doctor, his way of speaking, his way of looking at me. I had never met anyone like him, and I couldn't help but compare him to Pedro. He was everything Pedro was not: young, educated, with a life far from the poverty of the ranch. I began to frequent the hospital to care for Pedro, but in reality, my visits were motivated by something more. Every time I saw the doctor, something inside me ignited. Our relationship began innocently, exchanging a few words and smiles while I kept up with Pedro's condition. But over time, those interactions became longer and more meaningful. He treated me with a kindness I had never experienced, and I, after so many years of resentment and loneliness, let myself be carried away by that attention. As the months passed, the relationship between the doctor and me ceased to be professional. We met in secret at first, in the hospital and then outside it. Our friendship turned into something more, something I hadn't experienced in a long time, a real connection, a passion I thought I had forgotten. It was scandalous for the era, but I didn't care. While Pedro remained in a coma, I lived a silent romance, knowing that no one in town would suspect me. At the same time, I began to take total control of the ranch. With Pedro incapacitated, the responsibility fell on me, and surprisingly, I knew exactly what to do. I hired more employees, reorganized the lands, and every decision I made seemed to be the right one. The ranch prospered like never before, and in a few months, the profits multiplied. Everything I touched turned to success, as if an invisible force guided my hands and my thoughts. I knew the pact was responsible for this prosperity, and for the first time, I felt I had done the right thing. However, while my life began to take the course I had always desired, a shadow remained over me. Pedro was still in a coma, but I couldn't wait forever. My relationship with the doctor flourished, and the ranch gave me more money than I had ever dreamed of. The life I had always wanted was within my reach. But there was a problem: Pedro was still there. Although immobile and unconscious. Finally, after several months, Pedro woke up. For many, it would have been joyful news, but for me, it was like a sentence. I couldn't allow him to return to my life. There was no longer room for him in the world I had built. My relationship with the doctor was the only thing that mattered now, and Pedro, although weakened and convalescent, had no place in my new reality. I made a cold but necessary decision. I arranged a small, modest house for Pedro, far from the ranch. It wasn't much, but I knew he had always been happy with little. I paid someone to care for him, ensuring he had everything he needed, but I made it clear that I no longer wanted him in my life. When I told him, the rage and surprise on his face were evident. He was furious, but too weak to do anything about it. He rejected the help I offered, preferring to stay alone in that humble house, isolated from everything. People in town started talking. Everyone criticized me, murmuring that I was a cruel woman for abandoning my husband in his weakened state. Rumors spread quickly, and my reputation in town deteriorated. I became the topic of conversation on every corner. But I didn't care. Life on the ranch continued to prosper, and I had what I had always wanted: money, power, and the doctor by my side. Over time, Pedro ceased to be a concern. My life on the ranch had changed completely, and I felt free, at least for a while. The months that followed were, at least in appearance, the best of my life. The ranch flourished more than ever. Each harvest was more abundant than the last, and the businesses I had closed in town generated more money than I had ever imagined. Not only had I managed to advance the property, but I had transformed it into a source of wealth and prosperity. At night, returning home, I counted my earnings and looked around, thinking about how far I had come. My life with Pedro, the poverty, the routine, they were just a distant memory. Now I had everything I ever wanted. Money, independence, and the doctor. My relationship with him became more public over time, and although people kept murmuring behind my back, I didn't care. I was happier than ever. However, something in me began to change slowly. In moments of silence, when I was alone and the day had ended, a void invaded me. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, that feeling grew with each passing day. I had achieved everything I desired, but I couldn't help feeling that something was wrong. It was as if a shadow constantly pursued me, a presence that reminded me that none of this was really mine. My relationship with the doctor also began to change. At first, everything was perfect. He treated me with a kindness and devotion I had never known. But over time, things began to cool. The attentions he dedicated to me diminished, and the long, affectionate chats became short and filled with awkward silences. What was once a passionate and loving relationship began to crumble little by little. I tried not to give it importance, believing that, like all relationships, we were going through a difficult phase. I thought we could overcome it, that eventually everything would return to how it was before. But while the doctor drifted away from me, something else occupied my mind. Weeks after Pedro moved to his small house, I received news that should have been cause for happiness: I was pregnant. My first reaction was a mixture of surprise and excitement. With Pedro, I had never managed to get pregnant, and I always thought I was sterile. But now, with the doctor, it seemed I could finally form a family, something I had never considered as part of my dreams. I told the doctor about the pregnancy, hoping that this news would rekindle the spark we had lost. However, his reaction was distant, almost cold. He didn't show the excitement I had expected, and that left me even more confused. I didn't understand what had changed in him, but I tried to ignore his cold responses and concentrate on the arrival of our child. The first months of pregnancy were calm, without complications. I dedicated myself to preparing the house, dreaming of the idea of having a family. I felt that this baby would be the perfect complement to my new life. Everything changed in the last month. One night while I was resting, I felt a sharp pain. I thought it was normal, but soon I realized something wasn't right. I went to the hospital immediately, but it was too late. I lost the baby. The pain was indescribable, not only because of the physical loss, but because this tragedy struck me in the soul, as if an invisible force reminded me that everything I had built was based on a decision that now had a price. I tried to console myself thinking that these things happen, that it wasn't anyone's fault. But a dark certainty took hold of me: this loss wasn't natural. It was the price I was paying for my pact with the healer. I tried to repress that thought, but deep down I knew it was true. What I had done to achieve success and wealth was now beginning to collect its debt. The worst part was that there was no way to stop it. Months after losing my first baby, I became pregnant again. This time I was determined to be more cautious, to do everything possible to ensure nothing bad happened. But again, in the last month, the same thing happened. I lost the baby just before giving birth. The frustration and pain destroyed me, but still I tried to continue. This cycle repeated itself over and over. I became pregnant 9 times, and on each occasion, upon reaching the 9th month, I lost the baby. Each loss was more devastating than the last, and my relationship with the doctor deteriorated more with each tragedy. He, who at first had been my support, began to drift away more and more. It got to the point where we barely spoke. There was no longer affection, no hope, only pain. Our relationship, which had once been the center of my happiness, became a constant reminder of everything I had lost. We were no longer lovers or companions, just two people trapped in a cycle of suffering and disappointment. Despite everything, we tried to save what remained of our marriage, but it was evident that things would never be the same again. The final blow came one day like any other. The doctor was at the hospital performing routine surgery. I remember I was alone at home, trying to distract myself from my dark thoughts, when I received an unexpected call. Complications had occurred during the surgery, and he had suffered a heart attack. He died on the operating table. Upon hearing the news, I felt as if the entire world collapsed on me. Everything I had built, everything I had desired, was vanishing before my eyes. I was pregnant again, and the stress of his death was too much to bear. I lost the baby that same night, the day of the funeral. After that, everything changed. There was nothing left. My life, which had once been full of promises and dreams, had been reduced to an insurmountable emptiness. I began to realize that every person I became involved with suffered a terrible tragedy. Misfortunes accumulated one after another, as if destiny were punishing me without rest. I realized that everything traced back to that night when I made the pact. The price I had paid for my success and my freedom was now catching up with me in a way I could never have imagined. After the death of the doctor and the loss of the ninth baby, everything in my life fell silent. A heavy, crushing silence that filled every corner of my existence. What had once been a life full of ambitions, desires, and plans became a succession of empty days. There was nothing left to fight for. I had lost everything: love, the children who never came to be born, and the life I had so longed for. The ranch continued to prosper, but I no longer cared. The money that was once the reason for my boldest decisions now meant nothing to me. Every coin I earned was a reminder of the price I had paid. The wealth I had so desired, which had once been the symbol of my success, became a prison. I couldn't enjoy it, and every time I tried to do so, something reminded me that there was a pending debt, one I could never pay off. I began to have recurring nightmares. In my dreams, Pedro would appear again, always with his face deformed by rage and resentment. He looked at me with eyes full of pain, and in each dream, his words were the same: "You betrayed me, Maria. You abandoned me. This is your fault." His voice boomed in my mind even after waking, as if his accusations were engraved inside me. The first times I dreamed of him, I thought it was simply the result of my guilt. But as the weeks passed, the nightmares became more intense, more vivid. In them, Pedro not only accused me of betrayal but pursued me, trapped me, and always at the end of the dream, he dragged me back to the ranch, to the life I had so wanted to escape. I woke up every night drenched in sweat, my heart beating uncontrollably. Pedro's face, deformed by hatred, remained engraved in my mind for hours. In town, people avoided me. Everyone knew that although I had achieved what many desired, something dark surrounded my life. The murmurs behind my back became more frequent, but I no longer cared what they said. Deep down, I knew they were right. Something in me was cursed. Shortly after the doctor's death, I sold the ranch. The place that was once the symbol of my ambitions no longer made sense to me. I sold the lands for a good price and moved to the city, to Guadalajara, seeking to start over. I wanted to leave the past behind, forget about the pacts and tragedies. I thought that perhaps distance could free me from the shadow that pursued me. At first, life in the city was a relief. No one knew me, no one knew about my past. I bought a large, luxurious house, surrounded by comforts I would never have dreamed of in my early years of marriage with Pedro. However, that feeling of well-being lasted little. Money couldn't fill the void I felt, nor calm the fear that had settled deep in my soul. The dreams with Pedro didn't disappear. In fact, they intensified. In the city, surrounded by new people and experiences, his presence in my nightmares was increasingly powerful. Not only did he appear to accuse me, but in my dreams he began to drag me toward a darkness I couldn't understand. It was as if, although Pedro was dead, his spirit remained attached to me, claiming the justice he hadn't found in life. I isolated myself completely. I stopped going out, stopped talking to people. Even my former employees, those who once respected and feared me, stopped seeking me out. No one wanted contact with me. It was as if everyone felt the curse I carried. In every place I went, people looked at me sideways, with fear, as if they knew that misfortune followed me wherever I went. Finally, one morning I received news that, in other circumstances, might have moved me, but at that moment only confirmed what I already knew. A former ranch employee who had served me for years found me by chance while I was walking through a city plaza. He approached me nervously, as if carrying a heavy burden. "Dona Maria," he told me, almost whispering. "Your husband was found dead in the house where you left him." The man's words resonated in my head for a few moments, as if my mind resisted processing them completely. I knew Pedro was unwell, weakened, and had rejected any help, but I never imagined his end would come so abruptly. He explained that they had found him alone, in deplorable conditions, and that no one had noticed his absence until it was too late. When I heard the news, I remained silent. I felt nothing, neither sadness nor relief. For me, Pedro was already dead, for a long time, from the moment I made my pact with the healer. But knowing that he was finally completely gone left me with a strange feeling of emptiness. It was as if with his death, something in me had also disappeared. My life in the city continued, but it didn't improve. The days passed meaninglessly, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong with me grew stronger with each day. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, nothing could change the reality that everything I had done, everything I had achieved, was stained by a curse. Every time I tried to connect with someone, misfortune followed. It was as if my very presence was poison, a constant reminder of the decisions I had made and the price I had paid. The money kept accumulating in my accounts, but I no longer cared. I couldn't spend it because every time I did, I felt I was extending the pact, perpetuating the curse. The riches I had so desired were now a burden I couldn't bear. My large, luxurious house was empty. No one visited me, and I had no desire to go out. I became a shadow, a solitary figure trapped in the silence of her own decisions. One day while walking through the hallways of my house, I passed in front of a mirror. I stopped and looked at myself. I was not the same woman I had been when I married Pedro. My face was marked by the scars of time, but more than that, by the weight of the decisions I had made. My gaze was empty, and in the depths of my eyes, I could see Pedro's shadow, not in the mirror's reflection, but inside me. His presence had never left me. It was still there, as a reminder that you can never completely escape the decisions you make. That night, the nightmares returned with more force than ever. This time Pedro not only accused me but dragged me, as always, toward that impenetrable darkness. But now, by his side, I could see other figures. They were the children I never had, the lives I lost before they even began. They were all there, watching me, waiting for me to join them. I woke up with a scream, sweating and trembling. I understood at that moment that my life would never be the same. There was no way to escape the curse I had unleashed myself. The nights became endless. Every time I closed my eyes, the same vision assailed me, Pedro, the shadows of the children who never came to be born, and that enveloping darkness that seemed to claim me. It was as if I were trapped in a cycle from which I couldn't escape, an invisible prison made of the decisions I had made. I knew this was all due to the pact. I knew that sooner or later I would pay the price in full. The city, which at first had seemed like a refuge, became a hostile place. Although no one said it directly, I could feel people's glances, the fear my presence inspired in them. It was as if they knew something was wrong with me, that there was a darkness that followed me wherever I went. I isolated myself completely. I barely left the house, and when I did, I avoided contact with other people at all costs. I couldn't bear them looking at me as if I were some kind of bad omen. My house, although large and luxurious, felt empty. There was no longer life in it. Sometimes when I walked through the hallways, I heard the echo of my own steps, a constant reminder of how alone I was. In my mind, the images of Pedro and the unborn children continued haunting me even when I was awake. It was as if they pursued me all the time, as if they expected something from me. One afternoon while I sat alone in the living room, with the evening light filtering through the curtains, I felt I couldn't take it anymore. The pressure, the guilt, the loneliness, everything was accumulating, and my mind was on the verge of collapse. I knew I couldn't continue like this. I had to do something to stop this curse. Suddenly I remembered the healer. Since that fateful night when I made the pact, I hadn't thought about him again. But now his image assaulted me strongly. He had started all this, and perhaps he himself could end it. Was it possible to undo a pact? Was there any way to reverse the price I had paid? I didn't have all the answers, but at that moment I decided I had to return. I had to face him. Just thinking about returning to that place terrified me, but desperation was stronger than fear. That night I prepared my things and made the decision, I would leave the next day. I knew finding the healer wouldn't be easy, but Juana, if she still lived in the same place, could help me. The trip back to the countryside was long. The same lands that had once been my home now seemed completely foreign to me. As the rural landscape stretched before me, my heart beat strongly, full of uncertainty and fear. The hills and dusty roads reminded me of everything I had left behind.